Hi, my name is Bhrugen and welcome to DotNetMastery, the ultimate learning resource for .NET developers. In this video, we will take a look at how to implement localization and globalization in ASP.NET Core. In this video, we'll take a look at how to implement globalization and localization in ASP.NET Core. Globalization, often referred to as internationalization, is the process of making a product or content multilingual. A globalized product or website should support multiple languages. Localization, on the other hand, is the process of translating content to fit the demands of one locale, which means based on the locale, your website should adapt to its language. In other words, localization is the process of setting up the content for local geography, which is a continuation process of globalization. ASP.NET Core provides mechanism for adding local culture info into the middleware. Let's first take a look at what we will be building. We will be building a small application in which we are displaying Hello World and Hello World again with a C from the controller. Now, if someone wants to change the culture for this, they can write it in the parameter like FR for French, and that will display the content in French. Also, we have a drop-down here, so we will see other route without the parameters here. They can directly change the drop-down. We have English, Spanish, and French. So if you click on French, it modifies the text and it also modifies the drop-down to display the languages in French. If you go with Spanish, it will display the text in Spanish and also the drop-down. So this is the application that we will be building in this course. That being said, let's get started with building our application from the next video. What we'll do is we'll create an ASP.NET Core web application. I'm going to change the project name to Localization Globalization and we'll hit the Create button. We will select more options that we want, like we are using the .NET Core, which is the .NET Core 5. We'll go with the MVC and we will enable Razor Runtime Compilation. With this, we'll be able to make changes in the UI and refresh the page without restarting the application. I am on the preview version, but if you use the released version of .NET 5, this should also work. So with that, we'll create our project. Now we did not select any authentication, because of which there won't be any database in the project. In order to understand localization, we can do that without the database. So great, our project has been created here. When we are working with localization, we need to configure few things in startup.cs. First thing is we need to configure the services. Right here, what we have to do is we'll say services.add localization, and we already have that extension method. Here we need to configure few options. So we can say opt goes to, and then within the bracket here, we want to configure the opt we have the resource path. When you work with localization, you will have to add resource file in your project. What is resource file is basically if you're saying hello in English, what is the equivalent of hello in French or Spanish? So all that we will be logging inside the resource file. So we need to tell the application where that resource file will be located. So we'll say equal to here and we'll name the folder as resources. Once we add that, we need to create this folder. So let me copy this name so we did not make any spelling mistake. Right after the resources, you will have to add a semicolon. Great, once you do that, we'll right click on the project, add a new folder. I will paste the name resources and this looks good. Once we add the localization to our services, next we need to add the MVC. We have that dependency right now that we need to add the MVC. On that we can add view localization. This might change in future, but right now this is the way. In here we have to add some configuration. One of them is language view location expander format. On this we will call the dot suffix. After this, what we have is we again have to configure the options. Then if you want right here also, you can provide the options that you did before. So we can say OPT here, and we can provide the same options like this. Rather than providing that inside the add localization, you can do the same inside add view localization, and it works. I have already added that in the add localization, so I will remove it from here. So this looks good for the add view localization. Then let me minimize this, and we can do .add. We have the add data annotation localization. When you're working with Entity Framework Core with ASP.NET Core, then you have data annotations for validation. If you want those validations to automatically change based on the locale, then you can add the add data annotation localization. So with that, we have registered localization in our services container, but we still need to configure our pipeline. Let's take a look at that in the next video. Now that we have added localization in our container, we can configure that in our pipeline, which is inside the configure method. So in here, what we can do, we first need all of the supported cultures. So I can just add a variable here for supported cultures, and we'll give this an array. We want to give all the values for the cultures that we want. We will use English, comma, FR for French, and let's use ES for Spanish. Next we'll have the options. So we'll have the localization options, and in here we'll have the new object. This will be of type request localization options. On this we can set the default culture. We have 3 cultures that we want, but what should be the default culture in your application? So we can just say that will be support cultures of 0, which is English. Then we have more options that we can configure, like which are the other cultures that should be supported. So we have the add supported culture. We can pass our array here, which is the supported cultures, and we have the add supported UI cultures. That will also be the same, so we'll add the supported cultures. So basically what we are doing on line 54 when we say set default culture is we are telling the application that if you request a culture that is not supported, we will be serving the English resources. Then on line 55, we tell them how we want to format the numbers and currencies, and on the line 56, we are telling them that what should be used when we retrieve the resources. Right now we have all of this in our variable, so we need to configure our pipeline, which is app, and on there we have used request localization. In here we will pass all the options that we have, which is inside localization options. So with this we have configured our pipeline to use localization. This looks good for our configuration in startup.ces. But our main question now is how do we add cultures? So as you recall before, we added the resources folder. We have to add our resources so that we can use that in our application. Let me start with that in the next video. Before we proceed further, let's run our application. In here, we see the text welcome. I want to change this welcome to hello world. So we'll stop the application and we'll go to our views. Inside home, we have the index view. Here I want to change this to hello world without any space. Now based on the culture we are on, I want to modify this content. How will we do that? For that we need to add the resources file for every culture. Now when you have to add the resources file inside the folder here, you cannot directly go right click add an item. it has to be in a certain format. What format that is? The files must follow the same hierarchy that you have inside views if you want to change it inside the views. If you want to change anything inside the home controller, you need the same hierarchy inside the resources folder. First, let's try to implement that using our index view. So index view is inside the views folder, we have home and then index.cshtml. So inside the resources, we will right click, add a new folder with the same name as views. Then inside views, we'll add another folder with the name home. And in here, we can finally add the resource file. So we will select new item here and we'll search for resource. We have the resources file. The extension of these files is .resx. So what name do we want to give here? It has to be the exact name as the view, which is index. We can say .en for English culture and then the extension .resx. We will add this. The resources file is not a code-based file. It actually contains key value pair with name, value and comment. So name will basically be the text that you want to give to convert. So let me call this name as hello world and the value that I want to display here, let me make it hello space world with an exclamation mark. We'll save this resource file. Once you save this, let me close it here and then we want to use our culture here. In order to use localization in your views, at top you will have to inject some dependencies, which is microsoft.asp.netcore.mvc.localization.iview.localizer. I call this locally as localizer. So in here we can use the localizer variable. So we'll say @localizer and within the brackets here you have to pass the name. So if we go to our resource file, whoops, that did not get saved. Let me save that again. It was hello world. The value will be hello space world. We will press enter here. So now you see in the second line there is string 1. After this, if you save, then it will be saved. We'll double check. Yep, this is working. Now the name that we have is hello world. So in here, in the localizer, I will paste hello world here. And with that in place, let's run our application. This time you see the text got updated to hello space world with an exclamation mark. So we can see our culture is working. Now another reason our culture is working because this is for English culture, and if we go to startup, we have set the default culture to supported cultures of 0, which is English if you see in the array here. So that is the reason you can see our culture is working inside our index view. That being said, how can we implement that for French and Spanish? Let's take a look at that in the next video. As I said before, when you are working with localizer, the hierarchy should be the same as the view name. If you are dealing with localization in controller, that rule still applies. So if you are working with home controller, inside the resources folder, first we will have to add a folder. We'll call this as controllers. The controller's name here must match with the controller name at the root directory. Then within this controllers folder, we have to add the localization for home controller. So we can copy the index that we have resource files. We'll copy them and paste them inside the controllers folder. If you use index name, this will not work. You will have to change the name from index to home controller. The name must match exactly with the controller name. So we'll change that in all the 3 places. Once you change all of these 3, if you take a look at the text inside, it's the same text for hello world. What I will do is after the exclamation mark, let me add C for controllers we'll press enter and save this. That way we'll know that this value is from controller. So we'll press enter, save it, and I'll do the same right here as well. If you do not press enter and save, data will not be updated in the resource file. Now we have the resources for controller. How do we manipulate that inside the home controller? Now when we are working with the controller, within the class of home controller, we will create a private read-only field which will be of type iHTML localizer. This will be on home controller and we can call this _localizer. We need to assign this using dependency injection. So right here we will have the iHome localizer. For the home controller, we'll call this localizer and _localizer is equal to localizer. How do we use this in our index action method? When we return back to the view, we can get the localized text, and then for temporary purposes, we can assign that in a view data. I usually do not like temp data, but since this course is not focused on .NET Core, its main focus is on localization. So we'll use view data to save time. So here we can say variable test is equal to _localizer, and then you need to pass the name. If you see, the name that we have in index was hello world. So we can just copy that name hello world and we'll paste it right here. That will retrieve the localized data for hello world based on the current locale that has been set. If no locale has been set, it will retrieve that for English. Once we have that, let me set that in a view data. I'll just call the view data name the same, which is hello world, and I'll set this to our variable test. You can name this whatever you want. The last step that we have to do is we need to retrieve this view data inside the index view. So I'll just copy this h1, I'll paste it one more time, and rather than localizer, this time it will be view data of hello world. Let's save this and let's run our application. Great, now we see hello world which has been localized in English from our views, and hello world C has been localized using our controller. If you remember, we appended C to be sure that it was getting values from the controller. Let's see what Spanish culture looks like, and that looks good. Let's also verify the French culture. Great. So with this, you have a basic understanding of how localization will work. But in a real-world application, most of the times you do not want to add your culture in query string. What would you do in that case? Let's take a look at that in the next video. Now we have seen the English culture is working. How about French and Spanish? So for that, we already have a resource file. We'll copy and paste it 2 more times. I will change the names here to change them from English to French, which will be FR, and then Spanish, we will call this as ES. We have to change the text in there. So if we go to ES, I will paste the value for hello world in Spanish. Make sure after you change it, you press enter so that you see string 1 in the next line, and save this. We will do the same for French here. We'll paste that, press enter, and then save all. So we save that, and now let's run our application one more time. If we switch back to our application, we have the supported cultures which I have added as both French, English, and Spanish. So how do we see that in here? That is simple. Right here in the URL, if we say culture is equal to FR for French, you see the text got updated in French. If you say ES for Spanish, everything is working as expected. So with this, you can see how we can manipulate or localize the data inside our view using the iView localizer. But sometimes what you want to do is you want to pass data from your controller which has already been localized. Let me show you that in the next video. Now what we want to work on is if we do not want to do localization based on query string, we need to implement that using cookies. So how will we do that? We'll stop our application and we'll go to startup.cs. We will have to make some fundamental changes to our pipeline and middleware. Let's scroll up. Right here we have the services. We need to add more configuration to our localization for that. So let me minimize this. And in here we will say services.configure. What we want to configure on here is the request localization option. So we have those options and we'll configure that. So OPT goes to, we will add the support for cultures right here. So now let me show you another way of adding the supported cultures. So I'll call variable supported cultures is equal to new. We will create a list of culture info. In there we will be adding all the culture infos that we want in our application. So we want to add English, so we'll do EN. Let me copy and paste this 2 more times. Next we want Spanish, so ES, and French will be FR. We are adding those 3 in the list there, and then we added the default requested culture. And after that we had defined few options in our pipeline. So we'll say opt.default requested culture. This we can directly set to new request culture. And we'll pass EN here. Next option that we set was opt.supported cultures and supported culture UI. This will just set to the variable since it has all of the cultures. So we have supported UI cultures and great. Now we have added that configuration within our middleware services. So if we scroll down to our pipeline, so in here we can comment both of these lines out. I'll also comment out the use request localization. If we go up, we have added all of this in the request localization option. So right here, rather than doing all of that again, we can directly use that and we will register. So we'll say use request localization. Inside here, we can say app.application services. On there we have a method which is getRequiredService. Here we can use the options. So I'll say iOptions and I want to get the options of request localization options. In there we have everything set. So we'll call the .value. That will retrieve all of the cultures and it will add it to our pipeline. So this configuration looks good for our startup.cs. Let's continue in the next video. Now that we have added the configuration in startup.cs, what we want to do is if we go to our home controller, let me add a new action method. So right here, it will be an HTTP post action method because we will be posting when we change the culture in a dropdown. Then in order to create an action method, it will be public iActionResult. Let me call this culture management. Here we will receive one thing in parameter, which will be the name of the culture. Based on that name, we have to set the cookies. So we can set response.cookies, and what we want for the name here, we have that in cookie request culture provider dot default cookie name. What we want for the value here is cookie request culture provider dot, we have the make cookie value. Here we want to create a new culture. So we can say new request culture with the name that we receive in the parameter. So with that, we'll assign that to our cookie, and after that we can set the lifetime. So that can be set using cookie options. So cookie options, if you do control space here, you have quite a few options. I'll just set the expires to date time offset. and I will offset that by 30 days. And rather than response.cookies, it will be response.cookies.append. So with this, we are setting our cookie. What to do after we set that? We can just return and redirect back to index action. So right here, we can say name of and redirect back to the index action. So in this post action method, we are just setting our cookies and redirecting back to the home page. Now we need to add this view. Rather than adding a view, I will add a partial view. So partial views, we add that inside the shared folder. We have _layout. We will right click, add a view here. We'll make sure to go with the razor view, and we'll call this with underscore to determine that this is a partial view. We'll create it as a partial view, and I'll name this _culture. In there, we will have to inject our localizer, and we will also need the request localization options that we set in startup.cs. So if we go to our index, we can copy the localizer injection, and then I'll paste it one more time. This time I want to inject the options, which is inside Microsoft.extensions.options. In there we have the I options, and the type will be request localization option. We'll call this as loc options. Once we have both of these using dependency injection, we can create a div and a select tag. In here, we'll add a div and we'll add a form tag. What we want to display in this form is a drop-down with all the cultures. How do we do that? Let me just add a form tag right now, and we will add a select statement. Name, we'll call this as culture, and the reason we are doing this is in home controller we expect a string with culture, so we'll give this a same name, so whatever we are selecting in drop-down for culture, we will display them, or rather pass that to the home controller. So name, we'll have it as culture, then we'll use the tag helper ASP4. Here we want to have a variable where we will have the culture name, and then we need list for dropdown. So that will be inside the ASP items tag. We need to get those using the razor syntax in here. So let me first get a variable for culture, and we can use the context object here. In there we have features.get. And what we want to get is I request culture feature. This exists inside the localization, and that will give us the exact culture. So we can use this culture variable inside the ASP4. Next, what we need is a dropdown with all of the cultures. We have added that dropdown if we go to startup.cs. We have added that inside the request localization options. We have the supported culture. So we can get that from supported culture or supported UI culture. So variable culture list is equal to, we'll use loc options, which is on request localization options. On there we will say .value. We have the supported UI culture there, and then we want to use projection because we want a dropdown. So we can say X goes to new select list item, and we need the name and value. So the value here will be x.name, comma, we have the text that we want to display. So text right now will just say x.name as well. We'll change this in future, but right now we'll convert this to a list. So we have the drop-down list in the culture list. We'll add that in the ASP items. ASP4 is giving an error with the culture because within culture we further have to navigate to get the name. So in here we have the request culture. In there we have the UI culture.name. So that way we'll store the culture in ASP4 tag. We have done quite a few things here. Before we proceed with all of this, let's actually see what this is doing. How do we see that? One way of looking at it is if we go to our home index, right here we can add the partial view. So we can say partial and we'll give name is equal to underscore culture. Let's run our application and see how the dropdown looks. Great, you can see right here we have all the three locale. We have English, Spanish and French. But right now if you change, nothing happens. Let's work on that in the next video. Now that we have the dropdown here, let's see what should happen when we post any data. How do we take care of that? If we go back to our partial view, we have the form here and we can add more tag helpers here. The first tag helper I want to add is ASP action. What I want to do is when the form is posted, I want to call the culture management action method in the home controller. So we have the action, I'll say the controller will be the home controller, and I'll also say the method is post action method. Next, what we want is how this form will be posted. So whenever we change anything in the dropdown, let's say we want to post the form. So here we can call the onChange event and we can say this.form.submit. So that will submit the form as soon as you change anything in the dropdown. Let's run our application and see what happens. So we have Spanish by default. Let's click on English and great, you can see it is working. If we change it to French, you can see the localization is working without anything in the URL. And all of that is because we are taking cookies to store the localization culture. Let's move this localization to our navigation bar. So we'll scroll down, let me stop the application. We have that in index. Let me cut this and we'll open up the underscore layout. Inside here we have the li. Let me create a new li and paste it, and I'll give it a class of navLink. Let's run our application to see how things look. And this looks much better. Now the logic that we have is even if we are on privacy, if we change culture, it takes us back to the home page. The reason is we have hard-coded that inside the home controller to redirect to action. Rather than that, right here, we can expect a return URL. And based on that return URL, we can redirect back. So rather than redirect to action, we will just say local redirect and we will pass the return URL. Now how do you pass the return URL to the post action method? That will do inside the partial view. Within our Razor code, we can get variable return URL is equal to, we can check string.is null or white space, and we'll say context.request.path. If that is empty or null, we'll just return the local base path, else what we want to return is right here. We will say context.request.path.value, and then we also want to append the query string. So context.request.queryString, if there is anything, append that as well. So we have the return URL here. We need to pass that when we change anything. So inside our form here, we can pass the route attributes. So ASP route, and we'll have to call it the same name, which is the return URL. Write this, and we'll pass return URL. Let's run our application and try this one more time. This time, if we go on privacy and we change culture, we stay on the same page. Even though on this page we are not using localization, but it is changing that in our cookies. If we go to home, you can see it's working. So with that, we have optimized a little bit our culture partial view, but this is just the beginning. Sky is the limit when you have to optimize or change anything, and customizations are different for different websites. One last change that I want to show you is right now in the drop-down, we are just looking at the culture names like this. But if someone selects French, I want to display all of the other languages as well as French in their own language. Let's take a look at that in the next video. Now what I want to do is I want to add cultures for the 3 of the items that we have in drop-down. Where will we add the cultures for that? That view exists inside the underscore culture in the shared folder. So for that, if we take a look at the hierarchy inside views, we have a shared folder and we have underscore culture. So inside our views folder, we will have to add a new folder, which will be the shared folder. In there, we will have to add the localization for 3 languages. I will copy the home that we have and paste it inside shared. I will change the name for all 3 of them from index to underscore culture. Then we'll first work with English. Here, what will be the name? The 3 names that we have is EN, ES, and FR. What should we display in English? Let's display English, Spanish, and French. Let's save this and let me close the English culture. We'll do the same for Spanish and French. We'll save the Spanish one and let's modify the French one. And great, this looks good. Let's press enter and save everything. Now we need to use that localization. So rather than displaying the name right here in the drop-down, we want to display the localized name. So that's pretty simple now. All we have to do is we have the localizer in here and we need to pass the name. So localizer dot, we have the getString method and we'll just pass x.name. With that, let me run our application one more time. And great, you can see French is selected by default, so the drop-down is in French language. Let's select English here, and you can see the drop-down displays the text in English now. If we select Spanish, it works as per our selection. So with this, you can see localization in effect, and everything with our drop-down has been configured with displaying the data from view as well as from the controller. This is just the beginning of localization, but I hope you have enjoyed this video and make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be notified of new videos when they get uploaded.